Now, we need to look at Brazilian independence movements and the rest of Latin America's independence movements separately. For obvious reasons, they're gaining independence from different nations. Most of Latin America is gaining independence from Spain, while Brazil is gaining its independence from Portugal. So let's look at what happened in Portugal. And Brazil, and how did Portugal grant them their religious freedom? Now, unlike Spain, the Portuguese king and queen actually flee Portugal when Napoleon takes it over and head to Brazil. And they set up a new capital in Rio de Janeiro. They set up a new capital for the Portuguese Empire. And the king, the Portuguese king, will actually live in Brazil, rule from Brazil. He'll have his throne in Brazil. So he moves there after Napoleon's invasion. And I've got there, rule Portugal from Brazil. And no longer is Brazil seen as inferior. At least the Brazilians see themselves no longer inferior. In fact, they see themselves as equal to Portugal. So picture this. They now have, the king lives there, and the people of Brazil see themselves on an equal footing with the European Portuguese. And Rio de Janeiro, as I've got there underlined for you, becomes the imperial city. It leads to immigration of bureaucrats, which is good in that you get a lot of educated people in Brazil, but it creates some animosity because it threatens the authority and position of those already living in Brazil. But by 1820, things have changed. Remember, Napoleon's defeated in, can you remember what year? That's right, 1815. And do you remember what group gets together after the Napoleonic Wars and redraws the boundaries of Europe? That's right, the Congress of Vienna. And so the Congress of Vienna has reestablished Portugal. So the king decides to move back. And now people in Europe start to look down on Brazil again. Well, this isn't going to go over well with the Brazilians. And so Dom Pedro is the king's son, and he's left to rule. Now, what the king says to his son, Dom Pedro, he says, listen, Pedro, what I want you to do is independence is going to come to Latin America. I've watched what's happened all around Latin America, South America, and I know it's coming. So what I want you to do is I want you to be out in front on this one. I want you to really be out front, move out, and get ahead of this game. So when Brazil's going to be independent, I want you to declare independence, and then I want you to make it a government we can live with, which means it's going to be a monarchy. It means it's going to be a monarchy, because kings like to deal with other kings. All right? What's happening in the rest of Latin America? Well, oh, I'm sorry, before I get to that, what about these new nations confronting their old and new problems? What issues did they face? Well, one of them is, should Catholicism be our national religion? Are we going to be places that grant religious freedom? Are the Latin American countries going to grant religious freedom? What to do about slaves? Are we going to free all the slaves and create an egalitarian country? Or are we going to focus on economics and keep the slaves and try to keep life the way it's always been? And the choice really is to do the second one, an economic focus as a priority, particularly in places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil. Also, what are we going to do about the color distinction? Many mestizos and natives, Amerindians, are concerned that all that's going to happen, they've changed governments. Yes, they got rid of the Spanish, or yes, they got rid of the Portuguese. But in Latin America, all it's going to mean is we got rid of them, but we're still under the same corrupt, rich guys who are going to be a problem for us. So we still have those kind of issues going on. Okay, one of the things that happens down there is this Gran Colombia. I mentioned this earlier under Simon Bolivar. He's one of the guys who really leads independence movements in northern South America. Why doesn't it last? It's a good idea. I mean, this idea of we'll pull all the nations together, all parts of Latin America together. First of all, if you know anything about South America, there are a lot of geographic barriers. Number two, it's a big continent. There are great distances to traverse. Number three, there are poor roads. Yes, I remember. You remember those ancient people who had nice roads in South America? Yeah, they're the Incas, but they're only down here along the west coast, so we don't have great roads. Regional differences. they don't see themselves as all the same. They don't see themselves as all South Americans. So much like what we've talked about with India, there are political divisions. Think of it this way, guys. In order for all these little countries, if I go back a couple slides, in 1799, all these little countries, somebody's got to give up their power. Somebody's got to give up their power, and nobody wants to give up their power. They all want to retain it, so it's not likely to happen. Okay? All right. And the mass of the population is outside the political process. In other words, for the average person living in South America, Latin America, in the early 1800s and 1815, it didn't matter to them whether it was Portuguese or whether it was Amerindian native people. Basically, their lives did not change and were unaffected or affected very little by who's in charge at the top. It's not a matter of what goes on. And South America will eventually become, or this Latin America will eventually become 18 different nations. So we got a lot of issues to overcome here. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, Mr. McKernan, I'm a deep thinker, and I'm thinking, okay, so Spain and Portugal lost these places because Napoleon was creating all these problems back in Europe. But what happens when Spain and Portugal get their act together, back together? Aren't they going to want to come back and take these places over? Yes, they probably did. And that's a very good thought on your part. Yes, they probably did want to come back. So what keeps them out? Well, it's this right here. The U.S. issues something called the Monroe Doctrine. Under President Monroe, he says he's going to keep Latin America independent. And what he says is, he says that any interference by European countries in Latin America will be seen as a threat to the United States. You say, all right, that's it. The U.S. kept Spain and Portugal out. Well, kinda. Yeah, we talked big, but in 1820s, were we in a position in the 1820s to do anything about it? Maybe not. We probably weren't quite strong enough yet. So what does do it? Well, notice I've got Britain included in here. Britain is benefiting from trade with Latin America, so Britain will use its navy to help us enforce keeping other European countries out. They don't want, remember the old mercantilist philosophy, right? Your colonies provide you with raw material, and only you, if you're Spain, only Spain trades with Spanish colonies. But Britain enjoys trading with what were once Spanish colonies and Portuguese colonies, Brazil. So they like this business. So they want to keep the business going. They want to keep the money flowing. So, yes, the U.S. issues the Monroe Doctrine, but we could not have done it without help from Britain, who enjoys the trade and enjoys the nice things she's picking up from South America. All right, that's the end of part 2.